What's going on, guys? Billy here, and if absolutely anyone came up to me and said, hey, which drone should I buy? I would instantly point them in the direction of the DJI Mavic Air 2. It doesn't matter if you're a professional, it doesn't matter if you just fly for fun, and it certainly doesn't matter if you are a first-time flyer, because the Mavic Air 2 right now is the best value that you can buy in the drone market. I've been flying the propellers off of this thing quite literally. I've got two of them. I'm flying them all the time, every single day, and it's become one of my go-to options up there with my Mavic 2 Pro, and I'd suggest this to anybody that wants to take good aerial photos and aerial videos, and there's a whole lot to unpack here in my long-term review of the Mavic Air 2, so let's get into it. So I think a really important point to cover in a review of a drone is what else is available on the market. This lineup that I have sitting right here is basically every drone that is available right now that most people would be selecting from. Of course, there are other options available from PowerVision, X Dynamics, and a handful of other companies, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to focus on the more well-known drones in the space that most people would gravitate towards. So in price, we go from least expensive in the Mavic Mini to the most expensive in the Autel Evo 2 Pro. Of course, there is a much larger comparison to be made here than just the price, and with the Mavic Air 2 being the second to least expensive drone in this lineup, you'd probably think that it can't hang with the more expensive options here, but in my experience flying all of these drones over the past months, I can say that it is better than the Mavic 2 Zoom. It's relatively on par with the Autel Evo 2 8K, and it even hangs in there in some regards with the higher end Pro versions of these two drones. In fact, it actually beats them out in certain categories. Now, the reason that up until this point, this review has been so heavily focused on comparisons is because I'm trying to prove that the Mavic Air 2 is the best bang for your buck. As I said in the beginning of the video, and as it states in the title, the Mavic Air 2 is the best value that you can buy in a drone. Of course, we saw that lineup of all the really popular drones here on the market, and I spoke about how this drone can go toe-to-toe with some of the higher end offerings. If you guys want to see a little bit more of an in-depth comparison, I'll put some links in the description comparing the Mavic Air 2 to both the Mavic 2 Zoom, the Mavic 2 Pro, as well as the Autel Evo 2 8K, so those comparisons are off in a separate video. But if we look at a less expensive drone here, like the DJI Mavic Mini, which both of these drones are about double in cost apart. So this is $400, this is $800. We get triple, maybe even quadruple the value out of the Mavic Air 2. We get a longer flight time, we get a better transmission system, OcuSync 2, and with that, we get further range, we get a faster top speed, we get a more well-crafted design here, we get more sensors here in this drone. This drone has no sensors on the front and the back. And of course, in the DJI Fly application, we've got a lot more shooting modes. So even though the Mavic Mini is great for a beginner, I'd actually recommend the Mavic Air 2 over the Mavic Mini because you've got a whole lot more of a drone to grow into. So to get into exactly what the Mavic Air 2 features for that $800 price tag, I've broken things down into 4 categories: camera, flight characteristics, build, and remote. Rocking a 1/2-inch sensor capable of shooting 48 megapixel photos and 4K video up to 60 frames per second, this camera is better than what the Mavic 2 and Evo 2 Pro offer in some respects, and is essentially the same as the $1,400 Evo 2 8K camera, except for the option of shooting the overkill 8K resolution video. Now, even though the camera in the Mavic Air 2 might look better on paper in the specs and some of the other offerings in the foldable drone space, you and I both know that megapixels doesn't determine how good a camera is, and it certainly doesn't determine how good it is against its competition. Now, if you're wondering, how does a small 1/2-inch sensor shoot these high-resolution 40 megapixel photos? Well, it comes through what is called a quad Bayer sensor, and to dumb down the explanation of how it works, it basically splits each pixel into 4 quadrants, thus the name quad Bayer sensor. And if we take 12 megapixels and multiply that by 4, we get 48. So I would say the Mavic Air 2 has a true 12 megapixel sensor, outputting 12 megapixel photos, but when you switch into the 48 megapixel shooting mode, the photos do look just a tad sharper, and the EXIF data does read 8,000 by 6,000, but don't expect to have this full resolution, full output 40 megapixel photo because it's just not. And at the end of the day, I'd prefer a larger sensor in the higher end drone offerings than a fake higher megapixel count. I think that so far my favorite images come from the time that I took this drone out to Hartford, Connecticut to capture the skyline. The footage of course looks solid, which was shot in D-Cinelike here, so I've added some color correction in post, but if you want to download the full resolution untouched video files as well as the raw photos I'm going to show you here in a second, I'll put that download link down in the description. But what I think separates this drone apart from even the Mavic 2 Pro is just how smooth it flies. The sticks are dead accurate, the gimbal's constructed so well that even with a really strong gust of wind, wind, it doesn't waver, and it overall feels very nimble and agile, again, more so than the Mavic 2 series of drones. For those of you that are interested in shooting stills with the Mavic Air 2, the photos are great, they look super sharp, of course they're the fake-ish 48 megapixel photos. Also, the dynamic range is on point, the colors are on point. These have been touched up by me in post, but remember, I'm going to put a download link in the description to download these raw files for yourself to edit them and kind of see how they work. Moving on here, our next category focuses on the flight characteristics, so what the drone itself offers, and if you thought the camera was this drone's strong suit, you might think twice after seeing the aircraft specs. The top speed of 42.5 miles an hour has proven to be fairly pedestrian for the Mavic Air series of drones, but what really stands out to me here is the 34 minutes of flight time and the use of OcuSync 2 as its transmission system, which gives it a maximum range of 10 kilometers or 6.21 miles. When I saw that DJI was bringing OcuSync 2 to the Mavic Air 2, I got overly pumped. I got really excited. Usually they're kind of stingy with their higher end transmission system. They reserve it for their higher end drones. I thought it would be something that was only reserved for the Mavic 2 Zoom and the Mavic 2 Pro, but the fact they brought it here to their mid-tier offering in the Mavic Air 2 is just so much better. I could see them adding Wi-Fi into this drone, just like what came with the Mavic Mini, and don't get me wrong, the Wi-Fi in the Mavic Mini has really impressed me, but OcuSync 2 makes the experience of flying the Mavic Air 2 exponentially better. This drone, if you think about it, really is a dual threat. The camera is great, and the body, the aircraft itself, is great. I would say that the camera kind of is the same as what we got in the Mavic Air, with very iterative upgrades between the first and second version of the Mavic Air. Of course, we now have the 48 megapixel photos, the fake 48 megapixel photos. We've got a higher bitrate moving from 100 megabits per second to 120 megabits per second. And also we now get 4K video recording at 60 frames per second opposed to the 30 FPS that it capped out on the original Mavic Air. But where I think the biggest changes come in the actual body, the aircraft of the Mavic Air 2. If you look at both of these drones side by side, you can't really see any design similarities. DJI's old approach to their lineup was to make each of their different offerings look different, which is understandable. It made them easier to differentiate, and it kind of gave them their own personality. Now with the Mavic Mini, the Mavic Air 2, and the Mavic 2, the lineup has been streamlined in a way of a very similar design and naming scheme across the board. Some of my issues that came with the original Mavic Air weren't with the camera necessarily, it was with the body, the aircraft itself. Two of the biggest complaints that I know everybody will agree with me on here was the loudness of the propellers and the Wi-Fi transmission system, which was just unusable. I also didn't really like that the battery was mounted underneath. The remote controller design was very watered down from what we saw in previous iterations, and the specs showed just how much of a compromise buying the Mavic Air over the original Mavic Pro at the time really was. The flight time and that awful transmission system that I've already harped on were two of the things that you would have to deal with for the lesser price tag, and after you bought it, you'd realize that the loudness was also an issue. In this round of DJI's product cycle though, with the release of the Mavic Air 2, there's really no glaring issues or compromises that I can see that would make me say, well, you know, there's this one issue with the drone, maybe opt for the higher end version, and I challenge that notion in my comparison video between the Mavic Air 2 and the Mavic 2 Pro. The Mavic 2 Pro costs an extra $800 over what the Mavic Air 2 costs. That is double the cost of this drone, and I just don't think that there's double the value there. I think you've got to be a true professional to reap the benefits of the Mavic 2 Pro with the fuller 1-inch sensor and the Hasselblad color science. With that said, the Mavic Air 2 has proven to be a very well-rounded drone, from the camera to the performance to the body, which we'll get into the design here in just a second. But overall, the experience that you get with this drone far exceeds what you're actually paying for it. I can't believe that this drone is $800. I thought they'd slot it just a little bit higher than the older Mavic Air and keep that still in their lineup as like a lower tier drone, but they fully replaced the Mavic Air with the Mavic Air 2 at $800, and I can't believe that this is DJI's mid-tier drone. It's really a sign that this whole entire industry, the drone industry in a whole, is progressing very fast and is maturing very fast, which is something that I like to see. Anyway, we went over the specs. Now let's move on to the design of the Mavic Air 2. The body features obstacle avoidance sensors on the front, the bottom, and the back, providing you with the necessary obstacle avoidance that you need. There's no side obstacle avoidance sensors on this drone. The low noise props solve everyone's least favorite characteristic of the original Mavic Air, being its loudness when flying, and boy, is this drone quiet. When it's up at 80, 90 feet, it is tough to hear unless you're specifically listening for it. Overall, the tone and the pitch of these propellers when it's flying, it really is great. The gimbal has been vastly improved from what it was in that original Mavic Air, giving it more room to breathe and a further range of motion, resulting resulting in clean video with no props in the shot or no gimbal compensation. They even snuck an auxiliary LED underneath of the drone for landing in low light scenarios and to easier spot the drone in the air. Overall, it looks like a shrunk down Mavic 2 or a larger Mavic Mini. While we're on the topic of design, you guys know that I gotta bring the remote controller into things here. I would say that the design of a remote is more important than the design of the drone itself. It's what you interact with every single time that you fly your drone, and the Mavic Air 2 remote is far superior than what DJI has been offering with their older Mavic drones. When folded up, it's easy to stow away, and when your phone is in the clamp at the top, it's easy to hold and overall fly with. Look, I'll spare you my ranting, so if you want to get my full thoughts on this remote controller, I'll leave a link in the top right corner and down in the description to my full review of the Mavic Air 2 remote controller. So there's an elephant in the room. It's the DJI Fly application. It's the fact that the Mavic Air 2 uses the DJI Fly companion application. Now, when the Mavic Mini came out, it came with the Fly application, and it was a watered down drone, and it had a watered down app experience with the Fly application. But now DJI comes out with the very powerful Mavic Air 2, but they make it run on the DJI Fly application, which is very watered down, and it doesn't offer the same experience as if you were using the DJI Go application, right? Now, I understand that DJI wants to try and offer this brand new experience with some of their newer drones because maybe the DJI Go app was feeling a little bit stale, maybe it was feeling old, but I can say that they actually just refreshed what it looked like. They kind of overhauled the UI, they made things a little bit more transparent, they kind of changed the fonts around. I think it looks great. Why'd they have to go and make this totally brand new application and remove a ton of great features? This drone could be so much better. It feels weird even saying that because it's already so good, but it could be so much better if it had used the DJI Go application and not the DJI Fly application. There is just so many different settings and things you can change in there that power users can take advantage of, but they're not available in the Fly application. Now, I do have to say the Fly app offers a lot of really cool change-ups. It offers a couple of features that actually aren't available in the Go application, but at the end of the day, the fact that it uses the DJI Fly application is just such a bummer. That is probably my one and only complaint that I've got about the Mavic Air 2, and it would have been such an easy fix, but they decided to go with the Fly app, and that's kind of a bummer. Now, despite the fact that this drone uses the Fly application, which granted is getting its updates over time, and it's adding these features that really should be there from the beginning, from the get-go, but nonetheless, that's over with. The Mavic Air 2 right now is my favorite drone. I own the Inspire 2, I own the Mavic 2 Pro, the Mavic 2 Zoom, the Autel Evo 2 Pro. You guys saw my entire lineup, but right now, my favorite drone to fly is the Mavic Air 2. It offers great results, it's a joy to fly, it's solid. When I've got the drone just sitting there hovering, the image doesn't move, it's so still. You can just tell that with every single brand new drone release, DJI is really refining their software and making their drone fly better. Again, even with the Mavic Mini, I've said in my videos, this drone flies great. I'd say it flies on par, maybe even better than the Mavic 2 Pro for what it is. You can just tell their flight software continues to get better and better, and the Mavic Air 2 is living proof of that very notion. This is a great, well-rounded drone. As I said right now, it's the best value you can buy in a drone. I'd recommend it to professionals, everyday flyers, brand new flyers, anybody that's looking to get into drones. The Mavic Air 2 is a great value. I'm still waiting on that smart controller support though. And also, there's one thing I want to mention. I can't believe I forgot to mention this. This drone dives so fast. So if you're flying straight in sport mode and you begin to dive the drone down, we can go at a max vertical speed of 11 miles an hour compared to 7 or 6.5 miles an hour on the Mavic 2 Pro. This is so important to me because with my drones, I like to chase after objects, whether it's a boat, whether it's a train, whether it's a car. So for me, if I'm flying up above them, I can now get down to their level even faster, diving at 11 miles an hour. That is double, almost double what I got with the Mavic 2 Pro and the Mavic 2 Zoom, thus making this feel like a more agile, more nimble drone, even though the top speed is just a little bit less than what we get with those higher end foldable drones from DJI. I've got to say, they nailed it with this drone. I just don't understand what they could do to make this even better. But the one thing I can say is this is pushing on the heel of the Mavic 2 Pro, and they've got to do something soon because this is definitely cutting into sales of that more expensive drone. The one thing I'm waiting on is smart controller support. I wish I could add that here in my review video, but DJI seems to be a little bit behind adding the Fly app to the smart controller to use here with the Mavic Air 2, but that'll come with time. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this long-term review of my favorite drone, the Mavic Air 2, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.